This is a U.S.-China media brief produced by the UCLA Asian American Studies Center. The U.S.-China media brief features interviews with experts and other prominent individuals involved in studying and documenting the dynamic and ever-evolving relationship between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China. I'm Russell Leong, Director of the U.S.-China media brief of the UCLA Asian American Studies Center.
Maybe you can consider Asia Journal in the future.
That would be great.
Get more international. We're also looking for materials, and I think it would be great actually. And since you are an old hand, having published that essay
Maybe just old
10 years ago, let me ask you a question. You're a Korean, but also an Asian American, and so do you see the Chinese experience in Africa as linked with or distinct from the experience of other Asians, including Koreans, Japanese, and South Asians? And the other part of the question is, does also being an Asian American give you a unique perspective on what you have observed and studied?
I think in terms of subjectivity and my kind of positionality with my research, I think it definitely helps. It would help more looking at new Chinese migrants if I could speak Putonghua, which I can't. But I have a couple colleagues, Anna Chen and Tu Win, who've been working. I've been working very closely with them in doing some of this research. But I think in a similar way to when I was doing my research on Chinese South Africans, I think there's a familiarity and some level of kind of cultural connectedness that gives me some sympathy with Chinese migrant groups. But at the same time, because I'm not Chinese, because I'm not South African, I can have a bit of distance and a bit of objectivity. And looking at China and Africa as an American is also interesting, and as an American living in South Africa, because when you're looking at Chinese migration or China-South Africa dynamics in Southern Africa, one of the big players, both politically and economically, is South Africa. And South Africa doesn't often acknowledge the kind of huge role that they have in shaping the dynamics of a particular country, of smaller countries like Namibia or Lesotho. Certainly in Zimbabwe, how South Africa responds or doesn't respond to the politics in Zimbabwe has a huge impact on what happens. And at present, you have probably a quarter of the Zimbabwean population living inside South Africa because of all of the political turmoil there. So I think it certainly does help. There aren't huge numbers of Japanese or Korean migrants or immigrants as such in South Africa, although you do see a growing number, and diversification of Asians coming into Africa. One of the interesting things is where you see kind of high levels of anti-Chinese sentiment in Africa. You also if you look at the numbers of supposed Chinese in these countries, they're usually highly exaggerated and often also include Korean investors and Malaysian investors and Japanese investors, because much in the same way as in Mexico, I'm a chinita, in Africa, anyone who looks like us is from China, even if that's not technically the case. So it's been interesting, and it'll be interesting to see how these things develop. The other really big player in Africa in terms of investments and trade is India. And India has been coming in quietly, kind of in China's shadows. And I think it's really interesting, and it has an interesting impact on the way people perceive them, because no one takes pot shots at India in the same way that they constantly do at China. And so maybe there's a lesson that China might learn from the Indians there. I'm not sure. I mean, so much attention is paid to China and China's huge economic growth at the moment and their huge footprint, if you will, on Africa, but also increasingly in other places, bailing out American companies, in Latin America. So I don't know that any amount of kind of backpedaling or kind of trying to take a kind of a less decisive, less public, prominent role is actually going to make any difference. I think there are lots of people, particularly in the West, who are going to kind of look to see where and when China missteps. And you know, to some extent, that level of oversight, of being critical is necessary, certainly in terms of human rights issues, in terms of environmental issues. But I think one of the important things we need to do is maybe beef up African capacity to negotiate their own position more strongly, rather than kind of make decisions for them on America's behalf, or you know, from the West.
Also, it's very important for us here in the U.S. to know more about China-African relations from the African point of view, as well as the Chinese, because you know, we hear the U.S. point of view, but not the other two as much. So your research that looks at the people, the dynamics, the social dynamics, cultural dynamics, is really crucial for us, and so we're just very appreciative of your being able to join our media brief. And before we end, I'd like to open it up to other colleagues on my staff, Andrew and Chi.
So from your research in South Africa, other than China and India, which other country are playing an increasingly important role? Does, for example, Russia or European Union?
I think the biggest players in Southern Africa in any case, but I think throughout the continent has always been the EU and the US. From the former Soviet Union, not much, but there's often a lot more kind of linking of the emerging powers. And different groupings of them, obviously, but Brazil, South Africa, China and India, for example. I guess in some of these kind of different groupings, Russia is also involved. But in terms of investment in the country, I think you're definitely still looking at the EU, the US and China and India. I think those would probably be the four biggest players, but this is not actually the kind of arena that I work in, so this is kind of the background reading that I usually do when I need to look at migration. So, yeah.
And how can we obtain a copy of your book, A Matter of Honor, Being Chinese in South Africa? Is it available on the internet? Or?
It's available on Amazon.
Oh, okay. All right, the global store.
Bookstore, yeah.
Okay. And pleased to have you, and hope to work together.
Thank you very much,
Thanks.
Russell. Thanks, guys.